Good evening. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. I know you're all anxious for me to give you a rundown, an analysis of what happened at the People's Temple, the involvement of Charles Gary and Mark Lane in that operation, and my opinions or views for whatever they're worth. I don't mean to disappoint you, you loyal listeners, or put you off a week, but I really do want to assimilate the information that's come out so far. There's an information overload, as there is in every large intelligence type of operation, and information is coming out through all the various networks and talk shows and through the newspapers, and will be going on for a long, long time. I don't want my opinion, my hatred for Mark Lane to get in the way of my objectivity of this case. The question is whether he was an innocent dupe or whether he is the Rasputin and the manipulator that I've accused him of being in the past. Will remain open until next week, probably. Those of you that listen continuously, that have listened to Dialogue Conspiracy or have taken the tapes, know that constantly I have talked about him, particularly when he took a part into the Hustler operation with Paul Krasner last year. And many, many times I talk about Mark Lane. I talked so much that as soon as his name was mentioned down in Guyana and with the People's Temple, the phone began ringing, and I was getting about 75 calls in the last 3 days on the matter. So finally I decided that people could order tape number 365, which is December the 1st. Next Friday, I'll do a tape just on the People's Temple and hopefully answer some of your questions and give you my overview of what I think took place. And I'll just leave it at that. I'm not going to go into it right now. Several weeks ago, I brought up the subject of Pope John Paul II and my concern about where he was ages 19 to 25 in Krakow, working in a chemical factory, and is he associated with IG Farben, counterintelligence operations, and we'll go into more detail on that Pope, the current Pope, later, but as a continuation of asking that question or the series on the Vatican at the present time. Last week we talked about Pope John Paul I, his possible murder, and briefly on who would gain and the manipulations of covering up, the indifference of covering up his death, which obviously was to make ready for Pope John Paul II. And in this interim, I've read a lot of books. We'll be giving you the list of books on the Vatican and on the IG Farben operation. I'm sure that you can collect many more books than I have and begin to send me titles to fill in the missing pieces. And one of the subscribers to these weekly tapes sent me a marvelous book, and I'm going to talk about it on both sides today and analyze some of the material in it. It's called The Final Conclave by Malachi Martin. It's put out by Pocket Books, New York, 1978. You can get it right now. Pocket Books is a branch of Gulf and Western, which I thought was funny because in here Mr. Martin goes in and tells how the Vatican has money invested in Gulf and Western. But The Final Conclave is a very, very important book. And just before I get to it, I just want to give you a quotation. I don't know if I've read this before on the air or not, and some of you have it. It's by Ladislas Fargo, who wrote The Game of the Foxes and Patton. It's from the book called Aftermath, and I think we could read it quite often and share the information. He begins the introduction by saying, Martin Bormann, former Reichsleiter, head of the Nazi Party Chancery and Secretary of the Fuhrer, survived World War II and managed to escape to Argentina in 1948 with the help of the Perón regime. He said, I have authoritative proof that Bormann survived the war and went to Argentina in 1948. Then he goes on later in the book and he says, Monsignor Montini, and Montini is the Pope Paul VI, that preceded John Paul I. You have that list of popes that I printed out last week for you. Monsignor Montini headed the Section 2 of the Secretariat in charge of the day-to-day conduct of the Holy See's international affairs. More important in this context, Montini had under his supervision the Vatican Bureau that issued the refugee travel documents and the Caritas Internationalis, the Church's international welfare organization, which was at this time and for some years after the war one of the main charitable institutions that aided fugitive Nazis. Caritas Internationalis is not officially part of the Vatican Curia. Even today, when he wrote this book, it is not listed under the Curia or under the official register of the Holy See. In reality, though, it does belong to part of the Curia. He said even in 1949, branches of Caritas were aiding Nazi fugitives in their escape to Argentina, such as Dr. Hans Heffelmann, one of the accused at the euthanasia trial, testified at Limburg in 1964 when he described in detail how the Vienna branch of the organization supplied travel documents and money he needed to make it to Argentina. And around 1947, the Department of the Vatican Secretary of State Help Displaced Persons was under the direction of Monsignor Jose Montini, whose assistant in providing travel documents for refugees was an Argentinian priest named Silva. It was the latter who was the link between the Bishop of Genoa, Monsignor Giuseppe Suri, who's one of the chief conservatives of the Curia at the present time and a big wheel in the Vatican right now, the wife of the President of the Republic of Argentina, Senora Maria de Perón, and former Deputy Führer Martin Bormann. The main interview for them took place in the vicinity of Genoa, and they were all instrumental in removing Martin Bormann down to Argentina. I just read that for you now because the book, The Final Conclave, goes into the manipulations of Montini, later being so instrumental in wheeling and dealing in the financial world business of the Vatican that does affect the selections of the popes and foreign policy for both the Church and the United States government. Martin, in the book, gives a little historical background about Montini and the elections that are to follow. He said there was a struggle inside the Vatican that was far-reaching, a revolution that appeared on its way that the Roman Catholic Church would have to face. And that comes out again in the articles that I mentioned last week on the politics of the Vatican, whether it's going to meet the future and move with the future or stay in the past. The Vatican thinking is the conflict of Jesus versus Satan, the battle for the souls. And I think this is one reason why the Moonies and the various church cults have appeared, and the Billy Grahams and the TV Christians and the born-again Christians and the youth Christian movements, is to try to turn the entire world Christian through mass satellites, communications, and televisions, if not this entire generation, certainly the next one. Martin went on to say that the far left and the far right of the church doesn't represent the opinions of a majority. They never have, but for better or worse, their idea is this battle of Jesus versus Satan. And that Giovanni Battista Montini, who became the Pope in 1963, had a big part in swinging the minds of the church around from the way John 23rd saw the world, that Montini had a different view of the Jesus versus Satan group, and that he faced a direction, according to Martin, this is a quote, that the vast majority didn't want and didn't understand. He was a great innovator, but he saw over everybody's head. Now, he doesn't go into the role that I just quoted of siphoning these Nazis, being the Secretary of the Vatican, and shifting them out and getting ready for World War III, or creating the Spider, the underground Odessa Nazi network, writing these passports out of the Vatican. But certainly I don't think the people who suffered in Verdun or the streets of Europe that were bombed out or lost 80 million lives gone and 80 million more displaced would have approved of letting these Nazis out. They never questioned where they were. Many of them thought of them as dead or missing. And he has changed the course of history for the future. I believe he has. And Martin doesn't specifically say what he did to change the direction of the church. I'm interpreting that from what I know about him. But he said he faced it in the direction that a vast majority didn't want and didn't understand. Then he goes into the background of Montini, who he says was never welcomed by the Romans. He was never part of the Roman clique. He came from Milan. They called him the Milan Mafia. But I can see now that his ties in Milan had to be with Reinhard Gehlen, chief of Hitler's Eastern Division of Intelligence, because of his future connections and what he does with the Vatican investments. But they called him part of the Milan Mafia. And at one time, Montini was exiled. He wasn't trusted by Pope Pius XII. Even Pope Pius XII excommunicated him and sent him to Milan, where he built up his own power base and returned victorious as the Pope June 21st, 1963, months before John Kennedy is to be killed in November 1963. The 15th anniversary of that was just this week, 2 days ago. And Pope Paul brought with him from Milan his own architects, his own financiers, his own clerics, his publishing house, which has to be the minister of propaganda because he does get the best PR of any pope. He comes out as a lover of peace, a lover of the third world, and there isn't a piece of evidence I can see to support that kind of PR. But he had his own publishers and designers and art people and came in, and the people in Rome called him for years the Milan Mafia. He had this camaraderie among his servants that he brought with him from Milan, and they met a lot of hostility in Rome, but it didn't matter. He had the entourage that he needed. And Martin describes in the book, I'm quoting most of the time now, not from Aftermath, but from the book The Final Conclave by Malachi Martin, and he describes people around Montini, particularly Cardinal Villot, Villot. I mentioned him last week. Villot was the man who took over the Vatican. He has the important role when Montini died of securing and taking care of the interim business until the next pope is selected. When John Paul I was selected, Villot was the last person with him that night when he went to bed. Montini's very close cohort was with his successor, John Paul, and he also did that little knocking on the forehead, "Are you there?" that 3-time knocking to make sure he was well dead. Cardinal Villot has a lot of political clout, and this book was written before Pope John Paul died or was murdered, and John Paul II was selected, and he even goes into the book on page 76 how the Polish Pope was selected and mentions this Pope Carol and the manipulation of the Germans and the Americans to get the Polish Pope in. And the clique was Montini and Cardinal Villot, and he tells how he brought him into the Vatican, worked with him. This was a French cardinal, and how they worked together. And Villot, in quotes, developed a bureaucratic competence from a lifetime of petty bargaining. Pope Pius XII, I don't want to get you confused, so you can always look back to the insert that came with the tape from last week. Pope Pius XII manipulated the history like a game of chess. This is according to Martin. He saw the world as a chessboard with boundaries and geography and local history. This was a man active through the Cold War period. Cardinal Pacelli had been instrumental in helping the Nazis and the Italians in the period of the Spanish Civil War. Pius XII saw the world as a history board, that the enemy was Marxism, and this was his complex that we have to go after Marxism. And then came John 23rd, who saw the world differently, according to Martin, with a broad overview, one of peace, and he didn't feel that the world was a deadly conflict between the good and the bad, or Jesus versus Satan, or the Marxists. And he saw the world differently, with a larger change. Politically and ideologically, Martin describes that the vision that John had was that the world was divided for years with no validity, that people from all kinds of persuasions could get together and not harm each other and love each other. This was Paul 23rd. And that the old boundaries that separated people would disappear, and that people would get along. And maybe John's feelings was the birth of the real hippie movement, the real Jesus people, the simple people who broke down the barriers of rich and poor and black and white. And that was a warm time after the Cold War period, when John Kennedy had pulled back the invasion from Cuba, didn't go on a gung-ho tirade against Khrushchev. They had the nuclear test ban treaty, and the world looked like it was going to be a little better place for just a short while. I think the grieving after the death of John Kennedy, his assassination, and after John the 23rd was legitimate, and people sensed that the good feeling that they were trying to spread was coming to an end. And in John's place came the mysterious Milan Mafia, the Montini, the Secretary Montini, former Secretary to the Vatican, who replaced Pope John the 23rd and became known as Paul VI. The final conclave goes into the manipulations of Pope Paul VI when he came to the United Nations in 1965 with his entourage and his trip to the United States, and then he details what happened 1 year later in 1966, the countries that lost their civil liberties and the Vatican didn't speak up. He talks about Haiti, South Africa, Dominican Republic, Guatemala, Indonesia, the Cuban refugees, the Spanish refugees, the Tibetan refugees, and he goes into the mass movements of hundreds of thousands of people 1 year later after Paul VI was at the United Nations. And the book goes into the statistics of billions of dollars in armament that Paul sat before the representatives of nations who had accumulated armaments in 1966, and he goes into the billions of the United Kingdoms and the United States and the Arab nations, and how they could have prevented the war of June 1967 in the Middle East. And as much as said that the so-called religious leader did a monkey appeasement speech with no meaning at the UN, and then 1 year later all hell breaks out all over the world in 66 in terms of money and lives and murder and further repressions. And he goes into a secret meeting in 1969, which he describes as the most secluded in the papal study. It was at night, late at night, in the papal study on the third floor of the palace. No more secluded and secure and private time and place has been found for any previous meetings for popes, for any such ultra-secret meetings. I'm sure there have been some, but we're talking about a pope that helped the Nazis escape from Europe in the Vatican, who was in the OSS, and now he's having a secret meeting in 1969 with a man named Michel Sindona, S-I-N-D-O-N-A, and Pope Paul is alone with Michel Sindona. And at that meeting, he signs his signature. He says, Paul binds and obliges a good part of the Vatican finance and the papal monies. He turns over to Sindona, and he authorizes him to sell the Vatican's controlling interest, $350 million in one corporation, and he gives Sindona access to other Vatican funds for further investment. He feels that the money centers should leave Europe, they should go to the United States, and he takes a signature from the Vatican, from Montini, now Pope Paul VI, to go over the world and begin to put money into investments for the Vatican. Martin goes into the fact that as Secretary of the Vatican for Pope Pius XII, that he was trying to reform the financial administration even at that time, and that there were reports of manipulation of money. A 1954 report exposing Pope Pius XII of abuses of money, and at that time Montini was exiled for coming across these abuses. There's also mention of another scandal, Ernesto Cipico, who embezzled thousands of dollars of funds from the Vatican that was for Eastern European refugee groups. It reminds me of Herbert Hoover in the United States taking money that was supposed to go to refugee groups and putting in it to White Russian Tsar's army that formed the nucleus of World War II. He says that Montini knew that there were people with Vatican money, that they could buy wars, they could sell peace down the river. This is what Martin is saying, that they can sell peace down the river with this kind of money. And the only difference between one scandal and another, which is true any place else as well as the Vatican, is do you have protection in high places, and how much can you get away with? The background of the accumulation of Vatican wealth is important as where they're to invest it later and where it is today and how it affects the selections of our popes. And I'll run down it briefly just to give you a little background again on it. There was the Institute for Religious Works, called the IRW, that he describes in his book, set up, as I told you before, during World War I, that accumulated into assets of $3 billion. It grew into assets of $3 billion. There's no balance sheet that's ever been reduced. These huge amount of monies have now been transferred all over the world. They go back and forth, and even during World War II, money was invested in both sides. It's like the book The Merchants of Death, making weapons for both sides. It didn't matter if it was good for the investment, the Vatican profit. There was a body of money called the Special Administration of Holy See Property, a special administration known as SA, dating back to that year in 1929 when Mussolini was given 100 million, and in this book he says 2.4 million in exchange for staying neutral. That figure varies by 1 million depending which source you read, but that money was invested by three different banking houses. One, the J.P. Morgans in New York, the other, the Hambros Brothers in London, and the third was the Rothschilds in Paris. And by the late 60s, the IRW, that's the Institute for Religious Works, and the SA, the Special Administration of Holy See Property, had been invested in Italian industry and commerce, and it ran into the billions. It involved much of the industry that goes on just right located in Italy as well as around the world, even in a company that made birth control contraceptives. The Vatican had a share of that company. Then they invested money in the Societe Generale Immobiliare, the SGI, highly diversified, which included the Rome Hilton, the Pan American Building in the Champs-Élysées in Paris, the Watergate complex that was built in 1968 for $60 million, and the stock exchange in Montreal. Pope Paul VI worried about the European economy and started the PECA, which was the Prefecture of Economic Affairs, and began to invest elsewhere in 1968 and put money in the hands of a career diplomat by the name of Cardinal Vagnosi, who spent 9 years in Washington, D.C. So that the power of the Vatican, the power of investment, was now moved across the Atlantic, and it was on this side with this huge, tremendous amount of millions and billions of dollars. The IRW, which was the Institute for Religious Works, got a new head. They funded and appointed a new head, a Father Marcinkus, Marcinkus, a priest from Chicago and Cicero, Illinois, who accompanied Montini on his trips around the world and was under salary to the IRW in Illinois. And when I think about that, I wonder about Cicero, Illinois, or the relationships close to Chicago of the demonstration of the Nazis versus the victims of Auschwitz in that sensitive area. And were these provocateurs just a symptom of warming up of the future Nazi feeling, getting the American civil liberties to defend their right to say that they could kill blacks and Jews and do away with freedom of speech, which is what the Nazi party is about. And there is a lot of money from IRW right in Cicero, Illinois, and in Chicago. Paul's aim, according to the book The Final Conclave, was to stop the Vatican system of controlling interest in Italian companies and then put it in the blue chips in the offshore profits. And so with the secret meeting of Michael Sindona, selected as the man to do his overseas investments, we have an interesting combination because at one time, as I say, Montini worked with the OSS. He was active in setting up the Odessa, letting these people leave in the year 1946 to 48, which was the 2 years that the protege of Paul VI, Pope Paul VI, John Paul II, was in Rome. He was in Poland, in Krakow, and Wadowice, working for that chemical factory up till 1946, and he went to Rome for 2 years, and he was a protege of Montini up to the time that Montini died. And when Montini died, Pope Paul VI, he left all the political clout and framework for the current Paul John II. Sindona started with an interesting career. He worked with the United States Army forces in wartime Sicily. He had military contacts there, And according to Martin, he spent 20 years preparing for the work that he was to do with Martin, as if it took a lifetime of preparation for this moment that he was to meet and get this huge investment. I know Reinhard Gehlen wrote in his biography how an espionage operation, or rearming Germany from World War I to World War II, could take 20 years, and it didn't mean a thing, that you have a lot of time for important connections. And the book describes that he was almost set up for this special moment that when he was to meet Montini and receive all of this money for overseas investment. By 1969, according to Martin, Sindona was well on his way to become a great investment banker. By 59, he was well on his way, and by 69, he had signed the contract with Montini, Pope Paul VI, to make these investments. Up to that time, he had tax havens in Liechtenstein and in Geneva and all around the world. And by the time he came to Montini's attention, according to Martin, Sindona was a legal counsel for textile groups. He worked for a company called Keys Italiano. He was the president. He worked for Mediterranean Holidays, I guess a vacation resort group, the Philip Carbon Black Italiano, managing director of the Cheeseboro Ponds, a board member of Remington Rand Italiano, and he donated $2.4 million for an old people's home, which impressed Montini. And on the basis of that, he contacted Sindona to begin to make these investments for him. They go on to point out that he was a Freemason, but I don't know why they threw that in, I guess to fire the conspiratorial feelings about Masons that have been spread around. But Pope Paul VI felt that Sindona was an instrument in the hands of unknown powers, and yet he could go on from 69 and start investing all this Vatican money, and he moved quickly on several fronts, and they described his putting $40 million into a Luxembourg bank and $15 million into the California-based Gulf and Western, and Gulf and Western also owned Paramount Pictures. And then the Vatican investments began to spread to General Motors, General Electric, Shell Oil, which is Prince Bernhard and Juliana over the Netherlands, that formed the Bilderbergers and the Trilateral money, and the Gulf Oil, which was exposed at the time of Watergate. It was through the Gulf money down in Houston, Texas, that came in from Mexico, that went up to Maurice Stan's bank, the committee to reelect the president, and then down to Miami to Bernard Barker's bank. That was Gulf money, and then into the pockets of the Watergaters, all important, back to the Watergate Hotel owned by the Vatican. It's really a full cycle and a pretty cozy relationship here, and I don't mean to just throw out a lot of names, but the Vatican now is very well diversified with millions and billions, and into General Motors, General Electric, Shell, IBM, and some airlines. It says it doesn't mention them. Then Sindona went on to make, in quotes, forge links further with his banks and Vatican investments with the Continental Bank of Illinois. The chairman of Continental Bank was David Kennedy, the Secretary of the United States Treasury under Richard Nixon, and later a board member of Sindona's own company. A very cozy relationship of the Vatican money, of an OSS agent and Vatican money, to what is a really WASP, Gentile, non-Catholic organizations. He's meeting up with the Eastern Council of Foreign Relations, the blue chip companies of the United States, which are not Catholic owned and weren't, but the Vatican is investing money into the Protestant and other banks in the United States of America, and merging their future and their investments with their political and financial futures are melded with the power structure of the United States government, which basically is not Catholic. In 1968, the Vatican was having trouble with Italian authorities and was being penalized over some of its financial connections. And there's an interesting story here, because Aldo Moro, the premier of Italy, wanted the Vatican taxed on some of its investments that it had, these massive amounts of holdings that were not taxed. And Aldo Moro, who was kidnapped later and murdered, was opposing the Vatican's right to hold on to these properties and not pay taxes like ordinary citizens. In 1968, it began to worry Pope Paul VI about possible hassles of their holdings, and in 69 he gave control to this vast fortune of overseas money that the Vatican had, and he began to invest it in other places around the world. Sindona left the Vatican. According to Martin, he kissed the Pope's ring, and he left, in quotes, with as much financial power as many nations. And he went about dealing Vatican money into the foreign markets and investing it for the Vatican in the hands of Sindona, according to this material, ordered by Montini, the mysterious Montini of the OSS, who's now pushing the wealth of the Vatican into the hands of the U.S. financiers. On the other side of this tape will continue the links of the Vatican Empire to the blue chip companies and the power structure of the United States, which can easily explain why Mr. Brzezinski and the Kissinger crowd and the Rockefeller crowd can select the next pope to create the warfare state, along with their fears of Marxism and communism, and get us on the brink of World War III. This is Mae Brussell. This is tape number 364, and it's side 2, November 24th, 1978. It might seem strange to you that this is the anniversary this week of the death of John Kennedy, which I mentioned on the other side of the tape, the 15th anniversary of his death, and instead of talking about John Kennedy, I'm talking about the Pope, the series of popes, and the political use of the Vatican for the warfare state or for the control of the economy in buying large hunks of stocks, and then they can always threaten to pull it out if we don't move in a certain direction that protects the interests of the Catholic Church and the economy, the Wall Street gang, the Bohemian Grove, the crowd that Domhoff writes about in Who Rules America, can also order the Pope to move in certain political directions, or the Curia to vote for a certain Pope who will serve the best interest of the people who control the money that they've invested, so that they have this double relationship going now of investing overseas into the multinational corporations, and what was once a religious institution becomes a big investment. There was a big investment before in maintaining the form that the Catholic Church has, but as it is falling apart and people no longer want to go along with all the dogma, the priests may want to get married, women may want to be priests, they want to use contraceptives, the nuns don't want to wear their habits, the economy puts the pressure upon them to fall into line or else. And when you read the Gemstone Files, which I'm going to refer to in a few minutes, if we have time on this tape, Bruce Roberts gave me those papers. Most of you have the summary of them that was printed, the 20-page summary, but in the entire Gemstone Files, which is 30 pages long, Bruce Roberts talks about private telephone conversation that took place September the 2nd, 1978, a long-distance call that had to do with investigating the death of Howard Hughes, which Bruce Roberts maintains took place in 71, and I believe him. And he talks about the Tisserand Papers and the murder of Pope Pius XI, and that in Montini's vault is a document called the Summit of the Church, which has to do with the Vatican Church and the Mafia. And the Gemstone Papers are filled with references to Montini, the Pope that we're talking about here, who decided the Polish Pope would be selected. The Germans and Montini and the conservative cardinals decided that the Polish Pope would be the the one that was elected, and that is important because sandwiched in between, this other fine person had to die. But the thread of Onassis, then he goes in the Gemstone Files into Aristotle Onassis and Montini and the Vatican. And of course, we make a cycle to Jackie Onassis. I'm not making those connections in this tape. But the story of the Vatican is very important to the John Kennedy assassination. I have mentioned it before that Montini, I read on the other side of this tape, wrote the passport for Martin Bormann and other Nazis. And now there's a book out in London that I've referred to again in the past, and Treason is My Daily Bread, saying that Martin Bormann hired a specific gunman that did the fatal headshot for John Kennedy. So you can't get closer to the political clout of the Vatican than that. And I think that just to talk about the death of John Kennedy this week, I've expressed my feelings in doing 15 years' work into the assassination. I've dedicated endless hours and time and money and spirit. That's the main thing. You can't pay people to do the kind of work that the researchers are doing, the serious researchers into the assassinations. You have to love it, and you have to believe in it, and you have to hate fascism. And in doing that, that's a living memorial. So I don't think on the 15th anniversary of his death that I have too much to say on that, and we'll get back to the Vatican. As I said before, Pope Paul VI, with his advisors, and we don't know who his advisors are, whether they are Reinhard Gehlen and the CIA intelligence group that he was meeting with in Milan when he was, in quotes, in exile, his Milan mafia that kept him apart from the Roman clique. He had these advisors. They decided to go foreign, put their money in other places, and sent Mr. Sindona, as of 1969, out on the road with the Vatican cash. And Mr. Sindona was very close to Swiss authorities, Swiss banks, and the story is that he began to feel financial losses, that he invested it in the wrong places, and that the money was lost. And the story of Sindona was in the newspapers, the Franklin Bank in New York City. There was quite a scandal that the money from the Vatican, several $billion, was badly invested. But I know in espionage operations, what they call a bank robbery is sometimes a giveaway. There was the bank robbery in Nice where a gentleman, a far-right gentleman, a rightist, supposed to be a mole, dug holes out underneath, and later they caught him. He had gotten millions of dollars, and they caught him, and he was in the police department in France, and he escaped again from then and said the money was used for far-right organizations, and he's still at large, for all we know. And so I don't believe that what they call the loss necessarily was a loss of money. We won't know for sure, but I don't think that the Vatican necessarily lost that money, but I think there's a chance that they reinvested it over here and wrote it off as a loss with Mr. Sindona, because we really don't know the background of Sindona well enough to know, and Montini, this clique of how they got together, their 20-year reunion of how they got together. And I don't believe that people that were buying blue chips and going around and investing in Swiss banks and overseas in all these different countries actually did lose billions of dollars. In 1972, at the time of Watergate, this is just prior to Watergate, that story broke in June of 72, but Mr. Martin writes in Final Conclave that in 1972, Mr. Sindona transferred his family to the United States, took an apartment in the Pierre Hotel in New York City, and bought controlling interest in the Franklin National Bank, the 20th largest bank in the United States, and offered $1 million as an anonymous election contribution to President Nixon's campaign. Maurice Stans ran the committee to re-elect the president, and he offered $1 million from the Vatican, as they call it, an anonymous contribution. Now, this is terribly important because Bruce Roberts does talk in the Gemstone Files about the links of Pope Montini, and Montini is the man who gave all of this money to Mr. Sindona. I want to repeat this because I want it clear that he had a summit of the church meeting with the mafia, and that the allegation of Bruce Roberts was that Montini and Aristotle Onassis had built up a golden triangle that joint Marseille uh, heroin combine, and that Montini and Onassis were part of it, and they were pushing the CIA into, they didn't have to push them very far, but they took over in Southeast East Asia, where the French had left off. When the French left, the American CIA then took over with the blessings of Onassis and Pope Paul VI. Those are the allegations of Bruce Roberts. But Mr. Sindona says in the final conclave that they not only bought the Watergate Hotel, which we knew George Seldes wrote it in 1968, but had offered $1 million of anonymous money. Now, the only reason he can say that this was anonymous money is, if you remember carefully, the night of the arrest of Watergate Hotel, June 17th, 1972, John Mitchell and the hierarchy of the Republican Party were out in California at the Beverly Hills Hotel, then moved down to La Costa. But the hierarchy gave orders, and all night Maurice Stans and G. Gordon Liddy and the secretaries there at the Committee to Re-elect the President had shredding machines, and they proceeded to burn or shred every single paper that was in the office of Maurice Stans that gave a record of how he was paid to re-elect the President of the United States. And the Committee to Re-elect the President used their shredders. Nobody was charged. Sally Harmony or any of the others were charged with destroying evidence in a criminal case. Men had been arrested at the Watergate. And the next day they shredded the papers. And the papers were called the Gemstone Papers. This is common knowledge that the Watergate papers were called the Gemstone Papers. And it was after the shredding of the papers and after I got out my article on the Watergate, and I think it's because I was the first published article in the world making the connections of this conspiratorial team. I got a letter that I've referred to often by Andreas Papandreou saying, finally, somebody's making the connections from Greece. And Bruce Roberts, then, knowing that I was making these connections, gave me the entire Gemstone file. I have a copy, several copies made, out of the city, one out of the country, and I don't know who else has the whole complete Gemstone file, unless it's his mother or his immediate family. But in the Gemstone file, it goes into Pope Montini and Aristotle Onassis, and I think this is interesting because Jacqueline Kennedy had gone on and married Aristotle Onassis, the widow of John Kennedy, and the Gemstone papers were what was burned, shredded, I keep saying burned, at the office of the Committee to Re-elect the President. And the Gemstone papers, according to Bruce Roberts, were the links of the Pope, Pope Paul VI, who was former Cardinal Montini. Again, this cycle linked to the Kennedy assassination, his buddy that he got out of Germany, and many others too. I'm just naming one particular one because Martin Bormann is the most famous one. But what was going to happen with Maurice Stans and this money? What I maintained then and maintain now, and I didn't think it originally, it was Louis Tacklet who first turned me on to it, was the fact that after Nixon was elected, a Greek, again, Aristotle Onassis went entirely along with the Greek military junta, helped overthrow Greece. A Greek by the name of Spiro Agnew would become president because he was the vice president, and if Nixon was killed as planned down originally in San Diego, or then when that was called off, that Squad 19, he would be killed by Mr. Topping in the White House. That murder plan has been concealed for the major media, and someday I'll probably just have to do a story on the plans to kill Nixon in '72, because we talked about the death of a pope last week, and here the appointment secretary, Dwight Chapin, had arranged, and all they had to do was clear it through the Secret Service. And I wrote and said many times on the radio and radio shows before that the reason the murder of Nixon was called off, the Topping murder of Richard Nixon, the act to make Spiro Agnew president, the reason it was called off was that it would be linked to the money at Watergate, the Maurice Stans money, which again comes in from Gulf and Western, which the Vatican had invested in, and the Vatican now can say that they offered this money that was turned down as an anonymous. But the fact that the records were burned and Maurice Stans destroyed every piece of paper, we will never know. And I'm sure that the Vatican did put in money as an effort to make Spiro Agnew the President of the United States. You see, this is the way those millions of dollars work invested in the United States that weren't just in Rome property. If the Vatican keeps their money in the city of Rome, in railroads or factories or even making contraceptives, whatever they're doing, they can't affect the American economy except to tell their people to vote no in a communist election, give them $80,000, as we mentioned, because this is a sin, or pay the Pope off for another decree, and he gives the orders on down to these millions of innocent Catholics who are taking this and listening and hoping that he's telling or believing that they're always telling the truth. But when you bring all that money by the mysterious Mr. Sindona from Sicily, with the Mormon mafia combined with the Catholic Church, Watergate was a Christian, not a Catholic activity. Most of it was Mormon mafia with Catholic investment. What you really get is the moving of the Vatican money into the Wall Street Protestant gang. Now, this is a concept I believe happened based upon many, many years of research. You have to rethink your thinking now, because I'm giving you a hard question to think about in terms of new ideas. Sometimes we plow along with certain facts of who got this person out of Germany, where is Oswald's double. We work on the details of, did Jack Ruby go to the office of H.L. Hunt on Saturday afternoon? Those are minute details, but sometimes we work on grander plans based upon an accumulation of facts, and the facts in this case, the funding, the mass investment of the Vatican and the effect they would have on our elections. You see, if Spiro Agnew is in, or if they fund money to the Jimmy Carter campaign, or if the Vatican money is in Shell and they can influence psychologically former Nazis like Reinhard Gehlen working with the head of IG Farben, if Prince Bernhard was a director of IG Farben, if IG Farben has a chemical plant in Poland, if this Pope Carol worked at a chemical plant from the time he was 19 to 26 and then goes to Rome with Montini from when he's 26 years old, the years 1946 to 48, you can see a relationship not just on 1 or 2 or 3, 4 hour tapes, but take the total picture. When the men were caught at the Watergate Hotel, that pushed Richard Nixon out. He immediately pulled the rug out from under Spiro Agnew and sent him right out to Palm Springs. Agnew works around with the Middle East oil people now with Tom Charles Houston, who set up the entire counterintelligence operation for the United States. If Agnew had been in and the Pentagon and Tom Charles Houston were in, the Gestapo, as James McCord would say, was total. That's why McCord told Judge Sirica, I'm going to break this case because the FBI is lying and the Justice Department is covering up, the President isn't telling the truth, and if I don't, we'll have a Gestapo. And the Gestapo was Spiro Agnew and Tom Charles Houston from Indiana, and incidentally, our fine Reverend Jones came from Indiana, and the story of his route there is also yet to be explored, and we'll do more, hopefully, on the background of Reverend Jones, what he was doing in Indiana next week, and the connections of Mark Lane. But the point is that in this book, when they talk about Sindona making the move to New York City to the Pierre Hotel, I have to look up my research now on Martha Mitchell and see where she stayed when she was kidnapped, because I believe it was a hotel owned, I know it was owned by the Marriotts, and I have to check that out because I believe it was the Pierre Hotel. I want to get this tape done today and get it out in the mail to you, so I'm going to check that out for you over the weekend. But it just came to my mind that I think the Marriott stayed at the Pierre Hotel in 1972. That mysterious Mr. Sindona comes to New York, to the United States, just prior to the action at the Watergate Hotel that would remove the president, make Rockefeller vice president. Jerry Ford was always there, too. He was on the Warren Commission representing the Wall Street Combines and the Bilderberger Council Foreign Relations Group. In fact, I mentioned he was at the Bilderberger meeting in 1964 in the United States at the time he was still on the Warren Commission in March of 64. Well, in the final conclave, I'm going to read again. Mr. Martin says, Cardinal Villot, and to remind you again, that is the French cardinal, the last person with the current Pope John that just died. He was the last one according to the media, with him before he went to bed, the first to say those prayers when he was dead. Cardinal Vio told Pope Paul VI, Montini, about Sindona's dealings in the United States. Paul's memory was stirred with an age-old unease. Had he involved the Church more than ever with the power of this world? That is in this book, The Final Conclave. He begins to wonder, did he involve them? My answer is, how would he ever get that idea? Once you release a nest of the Odessa, the Spider, the war criminals, knowing that they want World War III, that they want Nazism all over the world, and you build up this financial empire of the Vaticans that they accumulated from World War I up to 1969. At the heat of 1969 was the year also of Tom Charles Houston forming the counterintelligence Gestapo in the United States, combining the FBI, CIA, National Security Agency, and the Pentagon, taking over the intelligence gathering, combining in the United States under the guidance of an admiral. In 1969, Montini is turning over the Vatican fortune that has accumulated through investments and other investments and financial fronts, and working closely with the Wall Street gang now. How could he believe in 1972 that he's involving the Vatican more than ever in the power of this world? The only beef I have about the final conclave, and I mentioned before, is that Mr. Martin puts a halo around Montini. He doesn't see these conspiratorial angles. But I think if you take every year of Montini's life and Sindona's life and overlay them to what was going on with the mafia and the military and the United States Wall Street gang, you'd see that Montini is not the little angel that he talks about. Now, he goes into the fact that Sindona in the United States begins to lose money, in quotes, for the Vatican. He's supposed to lose $48 million in 1973, $150 million in 74, $43 million from the Franklin National Bank. He lost money in controlled Swiss banks. And by January the 9th, 1975, he allegedly lost $240 million of Vatican money. And I ask again the question, was it really lost, or was it invested? Was it put into this Permindex? Remember the network of Permindex that has been credited to Credit Suisse, the assassination teams, and the also Permindex is mentioned in the National Labor Caucus newspaper. I don't agree with a lot of their conclusions, but some of their facts are very interesting, and they cite Credit Suisse and Permindex as killing Aldo Moro, the very man who wanted to tax the Vatican in 1968 as premier of Italy, that they were responsible for funding the terrorist group that killed Aldo Moro. So Permindex is still active with assassination teams if their information is true. And when they say that he lost $250 million, did they really lose that, or did that come over here to put up money, more clout for people like Brzezinski, Solzhenitsyn, the dissidents traveling, the dissidents' wives around, the lectures, the media, getting books out about them, writers? Was this money used to further this violent anti-Marxist propaganda, even going back now? I'm not going to tell you too much about next week's tape, but on the radio shows on KGO this week, they were calling in about Guyana being a Marxist country and a stronghold of Marxism, and you get cruelty in a Marxist country, and why would people commit suicide? They're down in a Marxist country. And you begin to hear that over and over, and while there were 300 to 400 deaths down there, maybe even more, they never talk about how many have died for the church. And even Pope John Paul II in his first speech says, be prepared to die for Christ. And I assure you he's going to kill more than 400 people. There are more than 400 people dying for Christ for some crazy reason, killing today, believing in Christ, joining Nazi groups, spreading hatred, getting ready to kill, buying their uniforms and armbands, marching, having their beer hall parties, and killing over in Germany. There are a lot of altercations, street altercations, race wars for Christ. There's more than 400 people that will die for Christ in the next 3 months, and yet the attention is directed on Reverend Jones. That doesn't justify what went on there, but they act as if nobody ever died for a church or belief, whereas this church advocates going out and killing for Christ, actually condones it. And Cardinal Cushing, a warfare cardinal, was just pushing for a total wipeout of the Asian population down in Vietnam to make ready for the white oil dealers and the dope dealers to take over from the native population. I just go into this because there's a lot of floating money going around here for dope and killing and selecting candidates. It takes a lot of money to kill a Pope John Paul I and get away with it. And it takes a lot of money to get all the cardinals to put in a man that was selected 3 years ago and get away with it. It takes a lot of heavy clout. It isn't the kind, you don't buy a pope by handing Cardinal Vio or Cardinal Sarah or various cardinals an envelope with a certain amount of money for each one, because that isn't what you do and it isn't what they need. But you spend money sending Cardinal, when he was Carol from Poland, you send to the United States, you have an entourage and a tour and the publicity and the engagements, and you have him travel to all the highest, every cardinal that has real clout in this country, if not everyone in the United States, and visit with them and let the people get to know them and make their appearances, so that when the voting comes in and they are selected, like he was selected, then everyone feels like they know him. They have a piece of the action. He's been to Buffalo and he's been to Detroit and Chicago and Cincinnati and San Francisco and Washington and New York, and everybody loves him because nobody else got the travel money, got the exposure, spent the time there. He's invited to teach a class at Georgetown. When I talked about the Pope for 1 minute on KGO radio, somebody gets furious. Another letter that somebody got besides the one I read you last week, they sent me an article. This Pope John Paul II was in San Francisco. How can you talk about him? He was in San Francisco, and they feel that they've invested a piece of the action. Their heart is in him because he's been to their city, this holy man. And that's the way the investment goes, so that this hidden money that Mr. Sindona had, he could have just transferred it to the powers that be over here and told the Vatican it was lost. And, of course, Montini doesn't have to grieve too much, because then he just reaches in the pocket, and $250 million wouldn't be a loss for the Vatican anyway. Martin goes on that Pope Paul VI put the institutional and hieratic church into a link. He said it was chained then to an international monetary system that belonged in principle and practice to the spirit of what he calls and quotes the Prince of the World. Two things were certain about Pope Paul VI's venture with Michel Sindona, according to the final conclave. He wished to align the Vatican and church finances with United States interests, and he wanted to detach the church in Europe with its involvement in the ancient heartland where it occupied a predominant position since early Roman times. Montini, as I said, was not a Roman. He was an outsider. He had been sent away in exile at one point, and Mr. Sindona from Sicily and Montini did align the church with United States interests, and the United States interests are to have a Polish pope to needle Russia, to arouse the Catholics inside the Iron Curtain. It was a stroke of genius. I'm sure it took a lot of money, and it took as much planning from 1969, when this marriage of finances went on. It took a lot of money and a lot of planning, and they got what they wanted in the end. On December the 8th, 1965, at the end of 4 years' ecumenical Vatican Council, there was a French Archbishop, Marcel Lefebvre, and maybe you've been reading about him in the paper. He said the Vatican Council was hijacked by bishops and theologians. He didn't like what was going on. He said they were acting in a spirit of Protestantism and neo-modernism. Now, did he have suspicions in 65 of what Montini was doing? He separated himself. He didn't like what Montini was doing as Pope Paul VI. Now, some interpretations are that Mr. Lefebvre was just too radical on the right, and that Pope Paul VI was the moderate. But I don't believe that was true. Montini, according to this book, and you can see it, it's all laid out for you, how they handpicked and select and jockey the next pope and put them into position. Montini selected this Pope Paul II from John Paul II from Poland. And as soon as he was in, Lefebvre got together with him just this week. The arch-conservatives of the Vatican, the the block, I guess, the 20 that wouldn't vote for Pope John Paul I, that gentle man that was able to live 33 days as Pope in the Vatican. These arch-conservatives will now meet with John Paul II, and they made their first overtures just this week, 2 days ago. Lefebvre, you'll read about him, the arch-conservative who disassociated with himself for any new changes that would take place, and he held out for the old guard to come in. And while it looked like Montini was making overtures to what they call the Third World, every country that he was reaching out to is fascist. The only socialist country, they said, they were talking about Ghana as being socialist, and it was put in by the CIA. That government was actually put in by the CIA. But those cardinals he works with from Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, Paraguay, Chile, there's no socialism going on down there. And it's just a real, pure, unadulterated Nazi takeover. The people are literal slaves. The Indian populations are being wiped out. There's genocide down there. And in Nicaragua and Guatemala and Central America and Costa Rica and all of these Catholic countries. And the story is that Montini maybe got too liberal, but what he was doing was accumulating this wealth and giving it to Sindona, who then invested it in the United States. And this is a very, very dangerous situation. Martin goes on in the book that says Mr. Cardinal Villot, who was very close to Montini, warned Pope Paul VI that Lefebvre must be suppressed. But yet it was Villot who took over the Vatican when Montini died, till a new pope came in, and when he was buried, he came in with his full conservative power, and now I'm sure that Villot will be very close to Pope John Paul II, and all the conservatives will have what they want, because now we can keep beating that story of the Marxism and the dangers and evils of Satan as against being Christ-like and loving God. Final conclave has chapters on how Pope Montini, Pope Paul VI, wanted to select the next pope. It goes into the fact that the next pope would be a non-European. He tells how the United States cardinals made plans to form their alliance with the Polish and German cardinals. There's a chapter on the pre-conclave activity and the campaigning in the Vatican, on the American initiative with the American cardinals deep in political clout. For the first time in conclave history, the American cardinals are into the Vatican politics in a deep sense. We always worked with the Vatican, but this book, published in 1978, said how we would help influence the cardinals to select their next pope. And when the Pope came in that they didn't want, the American businessmen and the arch-conservatives, they could kill him and then get the pope that they do want.